The chain hit the post with a sound like a gunshot, and every head in the Dusthaven trading post turned to look. Ezekiel Fletcher had been sitting at the far end of the auctioneer's platform, trying to figure out how he had ended up here when the iron collar appeared, and the woman wearing it walked out of the shadows of the holding pen with her chin lifted so high she might have been surveying a battlefield she had already won. She was not what he expected. He had been told, when the magistrate's writ arrived 3 weeks ago at the coastal inlet of Graving, that a bride arrangement had been made on his behalf under the old compact treaty, the one his grandfather had signed 40 years ago to end a border war, the one that still carried legal teeth nobody had bothered to pull out. He had been told she was an orc. He had been told she was willing. He had not been told anything else, and standing here now in the middle of the high plains in a town made of sun-baked timber and dried horse dung, watching her walk forward in iron, Ezekiel decided he had not been told nearly enough. Rasha Doomhammer was tall, broad through the shoulder, and built the way that cliffs are built, solid and certain and unapologetic. She wore fitted warrior's leathers, deep brown stitched with dark green along the seams, a cinch bodice that left her powerful arms bare to the shoulder, travel trousers tucked into knee-high boots, and a short hunting knife still sheathed at her hip, because whoever had put the chain on her had not been brave enough to take it. Her green skin was the deep shade of pine trees in summer, and her dark hair had been braided back from her face with enough force that it pulled the corners of her eyes slightly upward, giving her expression something severe and measuring. Her tusks were small, elegant things that curled upward on either side of her lower lip rather than jutting out, and they were marked at the base with thin silver lines that Ezekiel did not know, at that moment, were clan markings for a war captain's daughter. She was the most striking woman he had ever seen in his life, and she was being sold at a public auction in the dirt like livestock, and every man in the crowd around him was laughing. It was not a nice laugh. It started at the back, somewhere near the water trough where 3 merchants from the inner plains were drinking from clay cups and watching the proceedings with the lazy cruelty of men who had nowhere better to be. One of them said something behind his hand to the others. The others laughed louder. The sound spread forward through the crowd the way infection spreads through a wound, picking up volunteers until it became something collective and ugly and aimed like a weapon at the woman standing on the platform. Ezekiel watched her flinch. It was tiny, barely anything. The angle of her chin dropped exactly 1 degree. Her jaw tightened. The hand at her side curled into a slow fist and then deliberately uncurled again, finger by finger, in an act of iron-willed control that told him she had practiced not showing people what they had just done to her. She recovered almost instantly, chin going back up, face settling into something carved and distant, but he had seen it. He had seen the moment the laughter found the gap in her armor, and something shifted inside his chest with a hard, permanent click. He stood up. He was not a large man. Ezekiel Fletcher was 28 years old, weathered by salt and storm and 12 years of pulling nets on the iron-gray coast of Graving, with hands calloused to the point of bark, a lean build made entirely out of work rather than leisure, sun-darkened skin, and light brown hair that the sea had bleached at the ends. He had a broad, plain, honest face that nobody had ever called handsome, but nobody had ever called threatening either, which had always made him more useful than dangerous. And he had learned long ago that looking unthreatening had its own kind of power when you used it right. He turned around to face the crowd. He did not say anything immediately. He just turned and looked at them, all of them, but especially the 3 merchants near the water trough, whose laughter faded incrementally as Ezekiel's gaze found each of them in turn and held. He had spent 12 years at sea learning to read weather, and he understood the grammar of a storm gathering, and he let them see that he understood it, and that he was not moving, and that his hands were very still at his sides. "Something funny about a woman in a collar," he said. His voice was not loud. It carried the way a foghorn carries, not by volume but by the kind of weight that goes through walls. I must have missed it. The crowd had gone interestingly quiet. The auctioneer on the platform, a narrow man named Gord with a red sash and yellow teeth, was staring at Ezekiel with the expression of a man watching a situation deteriorate and calculating the fastest exit. The merchants near the trough looked at each other. The tallest one, broad-bellied with a green traveling coat, spread his hands in the gesture of a man claiming innocence. "Just a bit of sport, Fisher," the man said. He had pegged Ezekiel for coastal immediately, which meant he had been watching. "Nobody means harm by it. And yet there she is chained," Ezekiel said. "And here you are laughing. You can keep laughing if you want. I just thought you should know I noticed." He turned back around to face the platform before the merchant could answer. Rasha Doomhammer was staring at him, not the carved, distant stare she had used on the crowd. This was something different, direct and still and calibrating, the way a good navigator looks at the horizon when they are not yet certain what they are seeing, but they are paying close attention. Her dark eyes, which were nearly black, had moved off the middle distance and found him specifically, and she was looking at him with an expression he could not entirely read. Gord the auctioneer cleared his throat with the enthusiasm of a man desperate to restore normalcy. "Right. Well, we are here for a civil proceeding under the authority of the Compact Treaty. The subject, Rasha Doomhammer, age 26, daughter of War Captain Boru Doomhammer, is offered an arranged bond to the Fletcher line of Graven Inlet under the terms ratified by Take the Chain Off," Ezekiel said. Gord blinked. "Pardon. The iron collar, take it off. If this is a civil proceeding and I am apparently the Fletcher line, then I am telling you I don't want it on her. Procedure requires that during the formal, I don't care about procedure," Ezekiel said. "Take it off," the crowd murmured. Several things happened in the murmur that Ezekiel categorized and logged the way he categorized changes in sea conditions. There was surprise in it, and some hostility, and somewhere beneath both there was a small, cautious strain of something like approval from the people who had been watching the laughing merchants with their own quiet unease, and not saying anything about it. Gord looked around for support, found none, and with the air of a man cutting his losses, produced a key from his red sash and unlocked the collar. It dropped into his hands with a dull clank. Rasha rolled her neck once slowly, without looking away from Ezekiel. Then she said, in a voice that was low and measured and had the particular resonance of someone who was accustomed to being heard over considerable distances, "You are Ezekiel Fletcher." "I am," he said. "The fisherman," she said. She said it like she was checking a fact against a ledger and the ledger was showing her something unexpected. "The fisherman," he confirmed. Something moved across her face that he would later identify as the beginning of being interested, though in that moment it was buried deep enough that it might have looked to anyone else like nothing at all. "Then let us go somewhere that is not here," she said, and stepped off the platform with the authority of someone who had never been auctioned off in her life, which as far as she was concerned was entirely true. The treaty arrangements had included lodging, a room at the Dusthaven Way house, 2 adjoining spaces separated by a thin interior door, with a communal washroom and a yard behind the building where horses were kept. Ezekiel had arrived the previous day and stowed his pack, and his pack contained everything he had been able to carry from the coast in 3 weeks of hard travel by wagon road: a change of clothes, a good oilskin, his net-mending kit that he took everywhere from habit, a bone-handled fishing knife, a leather journal he had kept since he was 17, and 6 silver coins that represented the entirety of his liquid savings after paying the wagon fare. He was not wealthy. He had never been wealthy. He had inherited the fishing rights to a small inlet from his father, and he worked it alone most of the year because he could not afford a partner's wage, and the cottage at Graven leaked in 2 places when the winter storms hit from the northwest. He had been told the Compact Treaty obligation was legally enforceable, and that failing to appear in Dusthaven would result in the seizure of his fishing rights, which was the only thing he owned that he cared about, and so he had come. He had not, if he was being honest with himself, thought very much about what he would find when he got here. He had been too busy managing the practical details of traveling 3 weeks inland on a fisherman's savings to spend much time on the emotional architecture of the situation. Now, sitting across a rough-hewn table from Rasha Doomhammer in the Wayhouse's common room with 2 mugs of dark tea between them and the afternoon sun cutting through the dust on the single window, he was beginning to reckon with what he had walked into. "You did not want to come," she said. "It was not a question." "No," he said. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Her hands were large, capable, the knuckles bearing the faint traces of old scars in the way that working hands do. "I was given the choice," she said. "That is how I understand the treaty works. A daughter of the appropriate line, age of full majority, given the right of refusal. I did not refuse." "Why not?" She looked at him steadily over the rim of her mug. "That is a direct question." "I apologize if no," she said. "I prefer direct questions. I will answer it. My clan is in difficulty. The war captain, my father, died in the border skirmishes 4 months ago, and his second-in-command has been moving to consolidate power in a way that would leave my mother's family without land rights or clan standing. The treaty bond, if honored, gives my mother's family a legal claim under both Orc clan law and compact law that cannot be overridden by a war captain's second. It protects them." She paused. "It requires me to be here and it requires you to stay, but it protects them. I decided the trade was acceptable." Ezekiel absorbed this. Outside, the wind moved along the eaves of the Wayhouse and a horse in the yard made a sound of mild complaint. "And if I had not come," he asked, "or had come and been something you could not tolerate?" "I had my knife," she said simply, "and I had a plan for leaving." She glanced at him. "Your arrival altered the plan, because I told them to take the collar off." "Because," she said carefully, as if choosing each word from a supply she intended to ration carefully, "you saw me flinch, and instead of looking away, you turned around." The silence that followed had a texture to it. Ezekiel turned his mug in his hands, studying the grain of the table. He had not known she saw him see it. He thought about how it must feel to know that someone noticed the one moment you could not prevent yourself from showing, and tried to imagine what she was doing with that knowledge now. "I grew up on the coast," he said finally. "There is not much Orc-human trouble in graving. Mostly the prejudice was the kind that keeps people comfortable with being separate rather than the kind that goes out of its way to be cruel. I have not spent much time in the plain settlements." He looked up. "I did not know how bad it was." "Now you do," she said. "Now I do," he agreed. They sat for another moment, and then she said with some care, "The treaty arrangement requires cohabitation for 1 year in order to establish legal standing under the compact. After 1 year, dissolution is available to either party with no penalty." "I know," he said. "1 year," she said. "In this place." "In this place," he said. He looked at her across the table. "You said the arrangement protects your mother's family. Does your being here in Dusthaven specifically do anything more for that protection, or does the bond just need to exist on record?" She frowned slightly. "The bond needs to exist on record, and we need a settled address. The treaty language says a registered dwelling." "There's a cottage 2 miles north of town," said a voice from the bar. They both looked over. The barman, a weathered woman named Asta with gray streaks in her dark hair, and an expression that suggested she had heard many conversations she had not been invited to, was cleaning cups with a cloth and not looking at them directly. Was old Fenwick's. "He died in spring without heirs. The magistrate has been trying to find someone to register it." Ezekiel looked at Rasha. Rasha looked at Ezekiel. "How much?" Ezekiel asked. "For a compact settler." Asta set down her cup. "The registration fee is 12 silver, but if you're prepared to work it, there's a truck garden, needs tending, and Fenwick had a trade agreement with me for produce. I might be persuaded to front 8 of that 12 against future supply." Rasha turned her gaze back to Ezekiel. "You have money?" 6 silver, he said. "I have 4, she said. He stared at her. She raised an eyebrow with the expression of a woman who has always been practical about survival. He burst out laughing, which startled them both, and then she made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the same neighborhood as one, low and reluctant and real, and Asta behind the bar permitted herself a small smile and went back to her cups. They registered the cottage that afternoon. It was, by any honest accounting, more ruin than cottage. Old Fenwick had clearly declined at about the same rate as his property, and the truck garden was a knee-high forest of weeds with the ghosts of carrot rows underneath, if you were willing to believe in them. The roof held except in one far corner where something had gone comprehensively wrong with 3 consecutive shingles and their supporting timber, and the interior smelled of dried herbs and long absence and faintly mouse. There were 2 rooms, a main room with a cooking hearth and a table and 2 chairs and a sleeping loft, and a smaller back room with a pallet and a shuttered window. "I will take the back room," Rasha said, setting her pack down inside the door. "Of course," Ezekiel said. She looked at him. "You are not going to argue about the loft. You got here first," he said. He went to the hearth and began checking the flue. "Also, you are taller. The ceiling in the loft is low." She looked at the loft, which had about 4 inches of clearance above where her head would be if she stood on the ladder. She looked at the back room, which had a higher ceiling. She looked at Ezekiel, who was genuinely just checking the flue and not making a strategic point. "I do not know what to do with you," she said. "That makes 2 of us," he said, without looking up from the hearth. "Have you ever gardened?" "No," she said. "Neither have I," he said. "I know fish." "I know fighting," she said. "That's potentially useful in a garden," he said. "The weeds are aggressive." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "You are strange." "I have been told," he said. He had the flue working now and a small experimental fire catching. He sat back on his heels and looked at the flame. "I am also hungry. There is a stew house in town that had the lights on when we walked past." "Yes," she said, and there was something in the word that was almost a sigh, not of exhaustion but of something cautiously settling, like a rope paid out to its full length and finding the bottom. "Let us go and eat." The stew house was crowded for a weekday, which meant Dusthaven had more transient traffic than its size suggested. Wagon teams resting before the mountain pass to the north, traders coming down from the plains settlements, 2 obvious mercenary companies at separate tables pointedly not looking at each other. The proprietor was a large, cheerful man who seemed to assess his clientele primarily by their capacity to pay, and was satisfied by both of them. He put them at a table near the fire. The stare started within 30 seconds. Ezekiel noticed them the way you notice the weather changing. Rasha sat with her back straight and her hands folded on the table and her face arranged in the carved, distant expression he had seen on the auction platform. He noticed that she had gone to that expression the way someone goes to armor. He filed that away. "The stew is apparently venison tonight," he said, reading the chalk board above the fire. "And there's flatbread. Do you eat venison?" "I eat anything that has been correctly killed," she said. "What does correctly killed mean?" "Cleanly, without suffering." She looked at him. "I am not precious about it. I have killed many animals for food. I simply do not believe in causing unnecessary pain." "Neither do I," he said. "That's actually the same code I use with fish." She looked at him with the measuring expression she had started to develop when he said something she had not anticipated. He was becoming familiar with it. He liked it considerably more than the carved, distant one. The venison stew arrived and was excellent, and for a while they ate and did not speak, which was comfortable in a way that surprised them both. The stares from other tables continued, but receded in both their awareness as the food did its grounding work. Halfway through the meal, one of the men at the mercenary table said something under his breath to his companions and 3 of them laughed, and Rasha's spoon paused over her bowl for exactly 1 second before resuming, and Ezekiel watched it happen. He did not turn around this time. Instead he said, quietly, "You do not have to eat here every night. We can cook at the cottage." She looked up from her bowl. "You are not going to turn around and say something cutting. I did that once today." "I thought about doing it again and I think it would get old," he said. "Also, it is likely to cause a fight with mercenaries, and I am a fisherman, not a fighter." He looked at her steadily. "What I am doing instead is telling you that you do not have to sit in a room full of people who are being cruel to you. You have other options." She was quiet for long enough that he wondered if he had miscalculated. Then she said, "When I was brought here by the treaty marshal, he had 4 armed men with him. I asked him if the collar was necessary. He said it was procedure." She looked down at her bowl. "I have been in collars before, enemy captures. I know how to endure it. But I had not been in one in a long time, and I had not expected it here under a civil treaty." "I'm sorry," Ezekiel said. "You did not put it on me." "No, but I was part of the process that brought you here." He held her gaze. "I am sorry for that. I did not know. I should have pushed harder to understand what I was agreeing to." She studied him. The firelight moved over her face, over the silver lines of her clan markings, over the small curve of her tusks. "You are apologizing," she said, "to me." "Yes," he said. "Most humans do not apologize to orcs," she said. "They consider it a weakness." "Most humans I know are fishermen," he said. "We apologize to the sea constantly. It does not do much good, but the habit sticks." She almost smiled. He watched it happen in the line of her mouth, a barely there softening that she pulled back before it became identifiable, but which he had seen anyway, and which he thought about all the way back to the cottage. The first week at the cottage they worked rather than talked. There was too much to do for much else. The roof corner needed patching before the autumn rains arrived, and the garden needed to be cleared before anything could be planted, and the interior required a thorough airing and a less thorough but still significant cleaning before it felt like somewhere that belonged to people rather than to accumulated time. They worked alongside each other in the way that people who are still figuring out the perimeter of each other do, careful, peripheral, always aware of where the other was without quite being able to say why. Ezekiel discovered that Rasha Doomhammer was formidably good at physical labor in the way that people are when they have been doing it since childhood, not for leisure but for survival. She pulled weeds with a methodical intensity that he found almost meditative to watch. She had repaired the roof corner in 2 hours using techniques he had never seen, adapting fishing line methodology to the available materials in a way that was technically brilliant, and also made him feel slightly inadequate. She hauled water, chopped firewood, mended the fence around the kitchen garden with a post-pounder that she wielded with one arm, and at the end of each day she washed in the yard with the pump and sat on the step and looked at the plains stretching north and west toward the mountains with an expression that was so carefully empty of anything readable that he understood the emptiness itself was something she had constructed. He brought her tea one evening because he had learned on the second day that she would drink 3 cups of it before she started if she could, and he sat beside her on the step and did not ask her what she was thinking. "My mother will be at the summer camp by now," she said after a while, "by the Eastern Ridge. She will have received the treaty confirmation by courier." "Is she safe?" he asked. "Safer," Rasha said. "Marg, the second in command, he is ambitious but not stupid. He will not move against a family with compact treaty protection if he wants to maintain trade relations with the plain settlements. He needs those relations." And after a year, Ezekiel said, "When the dissolution option opens. In a year, my youngest brother will be old enough to challenge for clan standing in his own right," she said. "The window only needs to hold for the year." He nodded. He had his hands wrapped around his own mug, and the evening was cool in the way that high plains evenings are cool even after hot days, and the sky to the west was doing something extraordinary with orange and purple and the distant line of mountains. He sat with it for a moment and then said, "I need to think about what I do after the year. I have a fishing inlet to go back to. But 3 weeks in each direction on the wagon road is expensive, and the inlet is not going to manage itself for long." "You did not have a solution before you came?" she asked. "I had the treaty writ and 6 silver coins," he said. "I focused on getting here." She looked at him sidelong. "You are either very brave or very poorly prepared." "Probably both," he said. "They were not mutually exclusive on the coast either." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with a directness that was characteristic of her but that still surprised him in its specificity, "If we are going to be here for a year, we should make the best of it." The garden can produce enough to supply Asta and have surplus to sell. The magistrate mentioned there is a water fishing license available for the river 2 miles east, small river trout, nothing like the sea but income. And I can hire myself as a guide for the northern passes. There is traffic in autumn before the first snow. He looked at her. You have been planning this. I plan things, she said. I do not like being without a plan. A pause. I planned to leave when I saw the auction platform and the collar. Then I planned to endure it alone. Then you turned around and spoke to the crowd. She turned to look at him directly, and in the fading light her eyes were very dark and very intent. I had to make a new plan. What's the new plan? He asked, genuinely curious. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the mountains. I am still working on it, she said. He let it sit and drank his tea, and the sky went dark around them. Within 2 weeks they had fallen into a rhythm that was almost domestic in its ease, which surprised Ezekiel more than he could have predicted, given where they had started. The garden rose emerged from under the weeds like something resurrected. Rasha had a gift for structure. She organized the beds with a precision that he found beautiful in a functional way, and she was willing to take instruction on soil and drainage from his admittedly limited knowledge of tidal gardens back home, and the combination produced results faster than either of them had expected. He acquired the river fishing license and began making early morning trips to the eastern river, returning by midday with enough trout to keep them fed and a modest surplus for Asta's supply agreement. She began taking guide work, short trips to the first pass, a day out and back, with merchant groups who needed someone who knew the mountain trails and could communicate with the occasional orc patrol that checked the high roads. She always came back. He realized, sometime around the 3rd week, that he had started listening for the sound of her boots on the step. There was an evening when she came back from a guide run with a cut along her forearm, not deep but bleeding, and she sat at the table and dealt with it herself with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had been dealing with their own wounds alone for a long time, and Ezekiel came and sat across from her and said, "Let me help." She looked up. "I know wound care," he said. "Maritime injuries. Not the same, but the principles are the same. I have good antiseptic in my kit." She looked at him for a moment. Then she put her arm on the table between them and waited. He worked carefully, cleaning the cut with the antiseptic solution from his kit, which stung, and she did not make any sound to indicate it stung, which he noticed, and binding it with a strip of clean cloth. Her arm was warm under his hands, and he was aware with an unusual intensity of the specific weight and texture of it, the muscle and the warmth and the small silver markings that extended along her forearm from her wrist to her elbow. He tied the bandage and smoothed the edge of it and did not immediately move his hands. Neither did she. "What are these markings?" he asked, and his voice came out lower than he intended. "Clan marks," she said. Her voice was also lower, he noticed. "War captain's daughter. The full rank markings would go to the shoulder, but those are earned in battle, not inherited. These," she turned her forearm slightly so he could see the pattern, "record my father's line." "They're beautiful," he said. She looked at him. "Most humans find them frightening." "Most humans I know are frightened of the sea," he said, and looked up from her arm and found her face much closer than he had realized, and the carved, distant expression was entirely gone, replaced by something that he did not have a word for yet, but that made the back of his neck go warm. She pulled her arm back slowly. She stood up and went to the fire. He stayed where he was for a moment, staring at the empty table. "Thank you," she said to the fire. "Of course," he said to the table. That night he lay in the loft and listened to the wind in the plains grass and did not sleep for a long time. The moment that altered the architecture of everything came at the end of the 3rd week, on a market day. Dusthaven held a market on the last day of each week, when the wagon road traffic was highest, and the various trading post suppliers brought goods in from the surrounding range. It was the social center of the settlement, which meant it was also the place where whatever social dynamics were running hot in the community ran hottest. Ezekiel and Rasha went together because they had produced to sell and needed supplies, and because separately they would have attracted different problems, and together they were at least logistically efficient. The market was held in the open square between the weigh house and the magistrate's building, a packed dirt space big enough for 40 or 50 stalls, and about twice that many people on a busy day. They set up their produce beside Asta's supply table by prior arrangement, and the morning went well enough. The early customers were the practical sort, farmers and homesteaders with lists and not much time for theater, and the trout moved quickly, and the early vegetable surplus sold entirely within the first hour. It was when the morning crowd thinned and the midday crowd arrived, the more leisurely browsers, that the trouble started. It started with the green-coated merchant Ezekiel had seen at the auction. The broad-bellied one who had told him laughing at a woman in a collar was just a bit of sport. He had apparently not left Dusthaven when Ezekiel assumed he had. He arrived at the market with 3 companions, all of them the same type, inner plains money, traveling clothes that cost more than a fisherman's monthly income, and the specific confidence that came from spending their lives in environments where they set the terms. They stopped at the supply table 2 down from Ezekiel and Rasha's. They looked over. The green-coated merchant said something to his companions, and 2 of them laughed, and then all 4 of them started walking toward the Fletcher Doomhammer table with the energy of men who have decided that afternoon's entertainment has arrived. Rasha was arranging the last of the carrot bundles with her back to them. Ezekiel was standing at the end of the table and saw them coming and felt the change in the air that preceded bad weather. "Well," said the green-coated merchant, stopping in front of the table and spreading his hands in the gesture of exaggerated delight. "The arrangement stood, did it? I had my doubts. What's it like, Fisher, sharing your house with—" He paused, theatrically looking Rasha up and down as she turned from her work and met his gaze. With that, the crowd around them had begun the subtle reorientation of people sensing a scene about to happen. Ezekiel counted 15 people in comfortable viewing distance, and about 30 seconds before whatever happened here became fully public, Rasha looked at the merchant with a steadiness that had no fear in it and very little expression. "My wife," Ezekiel said. He said it with the same voice he had used at the auction, not loud but heavy, with the weight of something fully decided. "You were going to say my wife." The merchant blinked. The theatrical delight flickered. "That is not legally. Under the compact treaty, it absolutely is," Ezekiel said. "The magistrate countersigned the registration 6 days ago." He looked the merchant directly in the eye. "And you are at our market table telling jokes at my wife's expense, so I want to understand what exactly you think gives you the standing to be here." One of the merchant's companions said, "He's got some nerve for a," and another one said, quieter, "There are people watching," and the first one stopped. Rasha had set down the carrot bundle. She came around the table and stood beside Ezekiel, and standing beside him she was slightly taller, broader through the shoulder, and wearing the expression she had been wearing on the auction platform, chin up, eyes direct, not performing anything for anyone except that she was not flinching now. She had not flinched at all since the first word left Ezekiel's mouth. "My husband has asked you a question," she said. Her voice was the one that carried over distances. The 15 nearby people heard it clearly. Several of the 30 further people turned to look. "I would like to hear your answer." The green-coated merchant looked at both of them. He looked at the watching crowd. He looked at the magistrate's building across the square, where Gord the auctioneer had appeared in the doorway looking uncomfortable. He looked back at Ezekiel and Rasha standing shoulder to shoulder at a produce table in the middle of a market square, and he calculated what this specific scene was going to cost him in the specific currency of a trading post, where the magistrate could revoke commercial licenses, and where scenes that went wrong tended to get written down. "Good afternoon," he said, which was not an answer to either question, and led his companions away through the thinning space that the watching crowd opened for them. Rasha turned her head and looked at Ezekiel. He was breathing a little harder than normal, his hands flat on the table, and she could see that the steadiness he had projected had cost him something. Not because he had been afraid of the merchant, but because he had been afraid of something else. Some interior calculus about whether he had the right to speak for her, whether calling her his wife out loud like that without asking was overstepping, whether she would tell him in private what she thought of him deciding things on her behalf. "You called me your wife," she said. "It's what the treaty says," he said carefully. "It is," she said. She was looking at him with the intent measuring look that had become his compass for her interior weather. "You were shaking." "A little," he admitted, "but you did not move." "No," he said. She reached out and put her large, warm, scarred hand over his on the table. It was deliberate and it was in full view of the remaining watchers, and she did not look away from him when she did it. "Thank you," she said, "for the second time." He turned his hand over and held hers. "You do not have to thank me," he said. "I want to," she said. "There is a difference." They held hands at the market table in the midday sun of Dusthaven's main square, and the remaining watchers watched, and some of them turned away with various expressions, and some of them did not turn away. And old Asta 2 stalls down looked at them both with the small, satisfied smile of a woman who had placed a bet on the only race she could see clearly. It was the guide work that nearly killed her. She had been taking merchant groups to the first pass for 2 weeks without incident when she took a group of 4 to the second pass further, steeper, into territory that the northern Orc patrols checked less frequently because it was nearer the disputed border zone. She had done the route once before, she told Ezekiel before she left. She knew it. She was due back by nightfall on the second day. Nightfall came. She did not. Ezekiel sat up until midnight trying to tell himself there were a dozen reasonable explanations, whether on the high pass, a slow descent, a merchant group that had needed extra time. He was very good at constructing reasonable explanations. He had done it for 12 years at sea, whenever another fishing boat was late returning to the inlet. Most of the time, the reasonable explanations were correct. At midnight he got up, packed his oilskin and his knife and a rope, and every bit of food he had in the larder, and he started up the mountain road in the dark. He found them 7 miles up the pass trail at a place where the trail narrowed between 2 rock faces, and the merchant group had made a camp that was actually a barricade. 2 of the merchants were behind the barricade. Rasha was between the barricade and the trail, facing 3 armed men who appeared to be the remnants of a bandit group that had been operating the northern passes. There had been warnings about them in Dusthaven, Ezekiel remembered, warnings that the guide service coordinator had apparently not passed along. She had a short sword in her right hand, one she had not shown him before, drawn from somewhere in the configuration of her leatherwork, and she had a deep gash across her left shoulder that had painted the whole left side of her bodice dark, and she was holding off all 3 men with the focused, economical efficiency of someone who had trained for this since before she could read. Ezekiel looked at the 3 armed bandits. He looked at Rasha, whose position was solid but whose left arm was carrying damage and could not sustain indefinitely. He looked at the rope in his hand and the merchant barricade and the particular geography of the 2 rock faces. He did not overthink it. He went to the rock face on the right, climbed it with the 12 years of upper body strength that net hauling builds, and when he reached the outcrop above the 3 men, he dropped the rope down so it was hanging in front of the foremost bandit's face. All 3 men looked up. Rasha moved. She moved like something pulled taut and suddenly released, and the fight was over in 6 seconds, and 2 of the 3 bandits were on the ground and the 3rd was running down the trail, and Ezekiel dropped from the outcrop and landed hard and got up. She was staring at him. She was breathing hard, her left arm hanging at a wrong angle that made his stomach drop, and blood was everywhere on her left side, and she was staring at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, not the carved distant one, not the measuring one, not the one from the market table. This was cracked open. This was something raw. "You came up the mountain," she said. "Yes," he said. "In the dark," she said. "It was not that dark," he said. "There was moon." "You could have died," she said. "So could you," he said, crossing to her. "Let me see your shoulder." "Ezekiel," she said, and the sound of his name in her mouth in that register stopped him. She had never said his name like that, like it was something she was not sure she was allowed to use but was using anyway deliberately because she was deciding to. "You came up the mountain in the dark for me." He looked at her and he said simply, "Yes." She stood there with the sword still in her right hand and blood on her side, and the opened expression on her face. And then she crossed the remaining distance between them in 3 steps and put her free hand against the side of his face. And he felt the warmth of her palm and the roughness of her working skin against his jaw. And she looked at him from above at her slight height advantage with those dark, intent eyes. He reached up and put his hand over hers at his jaw. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. The 2 merchants behind the barricade were making small sounds of relief and rearrangement that neither of them paid any attention to. She bent her head and kissed him. It was not tentative. Nothing about Rasha Doomhammer was tentative. It was direct and warm, and she tasted of mountain air and the particular metal of adrenaline wearing off. And he felt it from his jaw to his feet. And he brought his other hand to her waist because he needed something to hold. And she made a sound low in her throat that was not pain despite the shoulder. And the sword finally dropped into the dirt beside them. They stayed like that in the dark on the mountain past long enough that one of the merchants behind the barricade made a pointed coughing sound, and then they came apart slowly, and she kept her forehead against his, and her breathing was unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the fight. "Your shoulder," he said quietly. "I know," she said, equally quiet. "Let me look at it," he said. "Yes," she said, and then almost below hearing, "I was not afraid when they had me on the pass. I have been in worse, but when I saw you come down from the rock," she stopped. "I was afraid for you." He took a breath. He thought about what that meant coming from her, and he filed it somewhere permanent. "I'm fine," he said. "Let me look at your shoulder." They got back to Dusthaven by midday, the merchants ahead of them on the trail, while Ezekiel and Rasha came down at the pace her shoulder demanded. He had cleaned and packed it with the supplies he always carried, and it was not as bad as the blood had suggested, deep enough to require careful treatment, but not deep enough to threaten function if she kept it clean and rested. She rested for 4 days, which she did badly, and on the 2nd day of resting, she relocated herself from the back room to the chair beside the hearth, and told him she needed to be near the fire and near conversation, or she was going to lose her mind. He brought his net mending kit and his leather journal to the chair across from her, and they sat by the fire, and he mended nets that were not there, going through the motions out of habit, and she watched him and then said, "Tell me about the coast." And he told her. He told her about Graven Inlet, about the way the water changed color before a storm, about the lighthouse on the point that had been built before anyone's grandfather, and was kept by a family named Caro, who had maintained it so long the tending of the light had become a kind of religion to them. He told her about the first time he had taken a boat out alone, 15 years old and terrified and trying not to show it, because his father had done it at 15, and he was not going to be the Fletcher who did it at 16. He told her about the seals that came to the inner rocks in winter and made a sound in the night that was almost like singing, and how as a child he had not believed the older fishermen who said you got used to it. She listened with her good arm across her knee and her dark eyes on him and her head slightly tilted in the way she had when she was fully present in a conversation. "Tell me about the clan," he said when he ran out of coast. She told him. She told him about Doomhammer clan, the summer camps in the eastern hills, the way orc children learned to fight the same year they learned to farm, because in the borderlands you could not know which you would need first. She told him about her father, his precision, his fairness, his infuriating insistence on doing things correctly even when speed would have served, and something softened at the edges of her voice when she spoke about him, something old and still painful. She told him about her mother, Hira, who was small for an orc woman, and had survived 4 wars by being more clever than anyone who had ever underestimated her. She told him about her younger brother Kale, who was 17 and furious about everything, which she considered developmentally appropriate. "You miss them," he said. "Every day," she said, "but you do not stop doing the necessary thing because it is painful." "No," he said, "you do not." She looked at him. The firelight moved over her face. The shoulder wound was healing. He could tell by the absence of the tightness around her eyes that she had been maintaining without telling him about it. The carved, distant expression had been absent from her face for days now, and he had the feeling, careful and tentative, that it might not be coming back in the same form, that whatever she had built it to protect had started to find other means. "Ezekiel," she said. "Yes," he said. "I did not want to come here." She said it looking at him, not the fire. "I told you that, and it was true, but I also need to tell you that I am glad." She said the word as if it had taken some effort to locate it. "That this is where I am, that it is this." A pause, and then she looked very slightly away, which for her was a significant concession to vulnerability. "That it is you." He set down the invisible net. He got up from his chair and went and knelt in front of hers, and he took both her hands, good arm and bad arm, gently, and he held them and looked up at her. "I am glad too," he said. "I want you to know that I understand what you gave up to be here, what it cost you, and I want to spend this year making sure you do not regret it." She looked down at him with her dark eyes. "You already are," she said. And then, with the directness that was her nature and that he was beginning to love like a fundamental law, "I would like you to come up here and sit with me." He sat on the arm of the chair and she leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, and they sat by the fire as the evening came and the plains wind moved against the cottage walls, and that was the night the distance between them closed completely. The weeks that followed were the best weeks of his adult life, and he understood this while they were happening, which felt important. The cottage worked. Not just structurally, the roof held, the garden produced, the river ran fish, but in the way that 2 people working toward the same thing can make a space work when they understand each other well enough to divide it fairly. She took the north side of the kitchen garden. He took the south. She managed the firewood supply and the structural maintenance. He managed the food preservation and the cooking, because as it turned out she had been eating camp-cooked meals most of her adult life, and his 12 years of feeding himself on a fishing boat had made him a practical and inventive cook. She brought in the guide income. He brought in the fishing income. Together it was more than enough for the cottage, for supplies, for the monthly treaty registration fee, and for a modest accumulation of savings that Ezekiel was beginning to think about in terms of the return journey to Graven without. He noticed with interest, thinking of it as something he would make alone. He thought about the inlet differently now. He had thought about it for 12 years as a place to work and a place to survive, a piece of inheritance that he maintained because it was the right thing to do, and the cottage at the water's edge had leaked and the winters had been cold, and the loneliness had been, on the bad nights, a weight he had simply learned to carry without naming it. He thought about it now and tried to imagine the inlet with Rasha on it, and the imagine was startlingly easy. She would stand at the end of the dock and look at the ocean with the same expression she used on the mountain passes, evaluating, interested, fully present. The seals would come in winter. She would listen to them. There was the matter of her shoulder, which healed. There was the matter of the evenings, which became the part of the day he lived toward. She had a habit of reading. She had brought 2 books in her pack, a military history and a philosophical text in the Orc clan tradition that she translated for him haltingly, because he could not read the notation. And she read by firelight, and occasionally said something out loud about what she was reading, which he responded to, and it became a kind of dialogue about ideas that he had never had with anyone before and had not known he was missing until it started. She was formidably intelligent. He was not a stupid man, but she was a different order of intelligence, comprehensive and structural, the kind that built frameworks before laying a fact into them. She made him think harder, and he told her so, and she said, with the manner of someone giving a compliment she had verified first, "You think honestly. Most people think to confirm what they already believe. You do not." He kissed her in the kitchen garden on a morning when the frost was coming off the soil in small silver evaporations, and she was pulling carrots, and he brought her tea, and she straightened up to take it, and they were very close in the small space between rows, and he could see his breath and hers mixing in the cold air, and he kissed her because there was no better moment, and there was no point waiting for one. She kissed him back with a thoroughness that suggested she had been considering doing this for some time, and had been waiting for him to close the remaining distance, because she had done the last closing, and it was his turn. He had both hands in her hair, which had come loose from the braid overnight, and she had fistfuls of his oilskin jacket, and neither of them said anything for a while, and then she said against his mouth, "You always wait until I think you are not going to." "Sorry," he said, not sounding sorry. "Do not apologize for this," she said, and kissed him again. They were in the north end of the garden, in full view of the trail to town, and a passing sheep farmer who was taking his flock to market, and had not been expecting this particular sight at this particular hour, made a small strangled sound and hurried his sheep along faster, and they both heard him and laughed. And Rasha's laugh, unguarded and real, was the sound that Ezekiel knew he would hear in his memory for the rest of his life whenever things were bad. The trouble came from the south. It always, in Ezekiel's experience, came from the direction you were not watching. A courier arrived from the Doomhammer clan lands 2 months into their stay at the cottage. Rasha read the letter at the table while Ezekiel stood at the hearth and watched her face do careful, controlled things. When she finished, she set it down. She was very still. "Marg has moved against my mother's family," she said. "He has challenged the treaty protection on the grounds that the bond was made under duress." Ezekiel came to the table and read over her shoulder. The letter was from her brother Cale, the 17-year-old who was furious about everything, and it was written in the Orc notation that Rasha translated for him out loud, sentence by sentence, her voice flat with the effort of keeping it flat. The argument Marg was making was that Rasha had been brought to the auction in a collar, which demonstrated coercion, which, under a particular reading of the compact treaty's duress provisions, could nullify the bond and therefore the treaty protection. He had hired a compact-trained legal advocate from one of the Inner Plains cities to formalize the challenge. "Can he do that?" Ezekiel said. "He is doing it," she said. "Can he win?" She was quiet for a moment. "The duress clause is real. It was written to protect Orc parties from being forced into bonds against their will. He is using a protection meant for me as a weapon against me, which is—" She stopped. She pressed both hands flat on the table. "It is clever," she said, in the tone of someone who genuinely respects a move they despise. "Is there a counter-argument?" he asked. "Yes, I made the choice voluntarily. The collar was auctioneer procedure, not the bond arrangement itself. The bond arrangement gave me the right of refusal, and I did not refuse." She paused. "And I have been living here voluntarily for 2 months without any attempt to leave, which would suggest the duress, if it existed at all, did not persist." "Then we go to the magistrate," Ezekiel said. "Marg's advocate will argue the other side," she said. "A formal hearing will be needed. The advocate will come here and there will be proceedings, and She stopped again. He could see her working through something interior, and he let her work. "Say it," he said quietly. She looked at him. "I do not want to lose this," she said. She said it directly, which was her way, but the directness was stripped of all its usual controlled distance. It was just the words with no armor on them. "I did not expect to say that. I did not come here expecting to have anything to lose. I came here to do the necessary thing for my family and to survive the year." And now she looked around the cottage, at the hearth and the table and the chair by the fire and the visible line of the kitchen garden through the window. "And now I do not want to lose it." He sat down across from her and took her hands. "You're not going to lose it," he said. "You cannot know that." "No," he said, but I can make it very difficult for anyone trying to take it. You have a legal argument, and I have whatever stubbornness 12 years alone on a coast builds into a person, and together I think we are a significant obstacle." He held her hands. "Write back to Cale. Tell him to document everything. And then we go to the magistrate tomorrow, and we make our case before Marg's advocate gets here." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she squeezed his hands once, hard, and let go, and went to find her writing materials. The magistrate was a woman named Aldara Heavyset, dry, with the particular weariness of someone who had been making legal determinations in a trading post for 20 years and had very limited patience for cases brought in bad faith. She heard them out, read the letter, asked 3 precise questions, and said she would need to convene a formal hearing when Marg's advocate arrived, but that in her preliminary view the voluntary cohabitation period was a significant counterargument to the duress claim, and that she would be noting it in the pre-hearing record. Marg's advocate arrived 9 days later. His name was Pell. He was from the city of Harvan to the south, and he was the kind of man who wore expensive boots in a dusty trading post without irony. He interviewed Rasha for 2 hours in the magistrate's building and came out with the expression of someone who had expected easier game. He filed his brief. Rasha filed her counterbrief, which she had written herself over 4 days and nights, and which was, the magistrate told Ezekiel privately with something approaching admiration, the most thorough legal document she had processed in recent memory. The hearing was set for 1 week out. In that week, something happened that Ezekiel had not anticipated. The town of Dusthaven, which had been watching the Fletcher Doomhammer household for 2 months with the range of reactions that any crossing of traditional lines produced in a community, from hostility to curiosity to the cautious, incremental goodwill that comes from watching people do good work alongside everyone else without asking for special treatment, made a decision. Old Asta came by the cottage 2 days before the hearing with a basket of goods and the information that she would be attending the hearing as a witness to testify to 2 months of professional commercial conduct and reliable supply. The sheep farmer whose flock Rasha and Ezekiel had startled came with an offer to testify to the voluntary nature of their cohabitation, which testimony had the side effect of requiring him to describe what exactly he had witnessed in the kitchen garden that morning, which he did with the air of a man willing to sacrifice some dignity for a just cause. The Merchant Guild representative, not the green-coated merchant who had quietly departed Dusthaven 2 weeks earlier, came with a letter documenting Rasha's professional guide fees and the satisfaction of her clients. None of them had been asked. Ezekiel was standing in the cottage doorway when Asta showed up with the basket, and he stared at her for a moment and then said, "Why?" And Asta gave him a long look and said, "Because the man in the good boots tried to use our magistrate's time to take away a woman's right to a life she chose, and we do not care for that out here." He told Rasha that evening. She was sitting in the chair by the fire, and he saw something move across her face that she did not entirely control, and she turned away toward the fire, and her jaw was tight, and he understood she was doing the thing she did when she did not want to be seen in a moment of feeling something too large. He went and sat on the arm of her chair and did not say anything. After a while she put her head against his shoulder. "I did not expect them to do that," she said. "Neither did I," he said. "I have never," she stopped. "I have lived among humans in the borderlands. I have fought alongside them and against them. I have been in human towns." She was quiet for a moment. "I have never had human strangers choose to stand beside me." He put his arm around her. He felt the great, solid, real weight of her against him. "You chose to stand in a strange place with strange people and do good work," he said. "People notice. Takes time, but they notice." She turned her head and kissed him on the jaw. It was tender, which was a register she had been accessing more as the months passed, and he tilted his head down to find her mouth, and she pulled him down out of the chair arm and into the chair beside her because the chairs were wide enough, and she was unwilling to break the contact. And they stayed there by the fire for a long time, her head on his chest and his arm around her, and the plane's wind outside doing its customary work against the solid little walls of the cottage that had been a ruin and was now a home. The hearing was held outdoors in the town square because the magistrate's building could not contain the number of people who showed up. Ezekiel had not expected that. Dusthaven held maybe 300 permanent residents and a fluctuating population of travelers, and the square was full. Not all of them were there for their sake. Many of them were there because a formal compact treaty hearing was unusual enough to be interesting, and the inner plains settlements did not see much legal spectacle. But they were there. The green-coated merchant was conspicuously not among them, and his absence was its own kind of testimony. Magistrate Aldara sat at a table in the center of the square with her clerk. Pell the advocate sat on the right side, very pressed, very booted. Rasha and Ezekiel sat on the left. The witnesses were arranged in a rough line behind them. Pell made his argument. It was polished, legally specific, and leveraged the duress clause language with genuine precision. He was good at his work, and Ezekiel gave him credit for it while also noting, with the satisfaction of a man who has done his preparation, that every argument he made had been anticipated in Rasha's counterbrief. Rasha made her counterargument. She stood up and she spoke without notes, and she spoke directly to the magistrate and to the hearing rather than to the crowd, which was the right instinct, and her voice carried the way it always carried, with that particular resonance of someone accustomed to being heard over considerable distance. She laid out the legal argument cleanly, and then she said something that was not in her brief, and that Ezekiel had not heard her rehearse. She said, "I want to be clear about what I chose. I came to Dusthaven because the treaty arrangement offered my family protection. That is what I chose at the beginning. What I have built here in 2 months is something I chose differently and later, and on no one's terms but my own. My husband is a fisherman from the coast. He is not a wealthy man or a powerful one in the way that wealth and power are usually measured. He turned around at an auction and told a crowd of laughing men that he had noticed what they were doing. He climbed a mountain in the dark because I was late coming home. He learns the things he does not know, and he does not pretend otherwise, and he stands beside me in every room we walk into." She paused, and in the quiet of the square, which was very quiet, she said, "I ask the magistrate to recognize that whatever duress existed before this bond was formed, no duress defines what it is now. I chose this. I continue to choose it. That is the only testimony I can offer that matters." Ezekiel was looking at the table. He was absolutely certain that if he looked at her, he would not be able to maintain the neutral expression appropriate for a hearing, and he thought it was important to maintain it, and so he looked at the table and breathed. Magistrate Aldara asked the witnesses to speak. They spoke. Asta and the sheep farmer, who was heroically matter-of-fact, and the merchant guild representative, and 2 of the merchants Rasha had guided through the northern passes who had apparently ridden down when they heard the hearing date. Pell cross-examined and found little to cross-examine. The hearing took 3 hours. Aldara declared her findings at mid-afternoon in the same outdoor square, with the same crowd still present because nobody had felt like leaving. The duress claim was denied. The bond was upheld. The treaty protection for Rasha Doomhammer's family held. The square made a sound. Not a cheer exactly. It was too varied for a cheer, too full of individual voices reacting at individual frequencies, but something that added up to approval and warmth, and the particular sound of a community that has watched something and has decided where it stands. Pell closed his document case with the precise movements of a man recalibrating for a different outcome, and said nothing to either of them and walked toward the way house, and Ezekiel watched him go and thought there was something cleanly finished about it. He looked at Rasha. She was standing beside the table with her hands at her sides and her chin up and no expression on her face, which he had learned to read as the specific face she made when the controlled outer surface, and the less controlled interior were in significant conflict with each other. He stood up and went to her and said, quietly just for her, "We won." She turned and looked at him. The crowd was still moving around them, and nobody was directly watching them in that moment. And she let whatever was happening inside her surface for exactly the time it takes to breathe twice. The fullness of it, the relief, and the fierce gladness, and the other thing underneath both. The deep-rooted thing that had been growing in the cottage by the kitchen garden for 2 months, and that she had been naming to herself gradually in the privacy of her own interior. Then she put her arms around him, in the middle of the town square of Dusthaven, in front of 300 people and their varying opinions, and held him. Not briefly. She held him fully, the way that people hold other people when they are holding the thing that matters most to them, and he put his arms around her and held her back with everything he had. He heard the square react. He heard Asta's voice somewhere in the crowd saying something approving. He heard someone whistle. He felt Rasha's slight suppressed laughter against his neck, which was a newer register for her that he had been accumulating like treasure, and he felt her hold him tighter, and he thought, "This is what it is. This is what I did not know I was missing. Not the arrangement, not the treaty, not even this town or this square or this hearing. Her. This specific woman who climbed a mountain and wrote a legal brief and said I continue to choose it in front of a crowd, who shows her feelings in the architecture of her silences and the direction of her gaze and the way she brings him back into the chair with her because she will not break the contact. This. He held her in the Dusthaven Square with the crowd around them and the high plain sun overhead and the mountains in the north where she had almost died and did not. And he thought that 12 years alone on a coast in a leaking cottage had been preparing him for this moment in the way that all the long, hard, unnoticed preparation secretly does, not by making him worthy of her, because he was not sure worthiness was the currency here, but by making him certain, all the way down, that he was not going to let go. She pulled back eventually to the degree needed to look at his face, and she looked at him with both the directness and the openness that he now understood were not opposites in her but the same thing wearing 2 expressions, and she said quietly, "What happens now?" "I think we go home," he said, "and I cook something good and you drink 3 cups of tea before you start and we sit by the fire." "And after the year," she said. "What do you want to happen after the year?" he asked. She considered it. She considered it honestly, which was the only way she did anything, weighing it in the same thorough, structural way she weighed everything. "I want to see the coast," she said. "I want to hear the seals in winter. I want to meet the lighthouse family." A pause. "I want to be where you are." "Then we go to graving," he said, "and we fix the roof properly before the northwest storms hit, and you tell me everything I have been doing wrong with the inlet for 12 years, and I listen." She smiled. Not the pulled-back almost smile, not the reluctant low sound of laughter. A full, real smile, and her tusks showed, and the silver marks at their base caught the afternoon light, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in front of the mountains or anywhere else. "I will have many opinions," she said. "I know," he said. "I am counting on it." She kissed him in the square, which was neither brief nor tentative, and the crowd that had been watching all afternoon made a sound that was definitely, this time, a cheer, and old Asta's voice cut through all of it saying something about it being about time, and the high plains afternoon opened around them golden and wide and entirely finished with being a problem. They left Dusthaven on the first clear morning of late autumn, when the ground was hard with first frost, and the wagon road south ran straight and pale under a pale sky, and the mountains to the north were finally showing snow on their upper reaches. They had the cottage registered in good order, their accounts settled with the magistrate and with Asta and with the guild. Rasha had written to her mother and to Kale, and the reply from her mother had come 2 days before they left, in the Orc notation, which Rasha read aloud to Ezekiel at the kitchen table, and which said that the treaty protection held, that Marg had withdrawn his challenge entirely following the hearing's outcome, and that here a Doomhammer would very much like to meet the human who had been worth her daughter's choosing. Rasha had folded the letter carefully and put it inside her pack, and she had not said much about it, and Ezekiel had not asked her to, because he was learning the specific language of what she needed space around. They took the wagon south and then east, toward the coast road. Ezekiel's hands on the reins were the same hands they had always been calloused, practical, salt-etched at the knuckles. But something in them felt different, or perhaps the difference was in how much more content those hands felt, occupied with something that meant something, going somewhere that was no longer just a place to work but a place to go back to together. Rasha sat beside him on the wagon bench wrapped in her hunting leather with a traveling cloak over it against the cold, her long dark braid out in the wind, watching the plains roll by with the evaluating, interested look that she used on new landscapes. She had her thigh pressed against his on the bench, which she had done from the first morning of the journey without comment, and which he had leaned into equally without comment. And they rode the first day mostly in comfortable quiet broken by observations about the terrain and the weather and one spirited argument about navigation, by stars versus navigation by landmark that concluded without resolution, and was obviously going to continue. On the second evening, camped off the road in a hollow where the wind was less brutal, she sat close to the fire and looked at him across it and said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. "I have thought about what I said at the hearing," she said. "What I said about what you did, and I want to say it differently because I said it in a legal proceeding and that is not the right place for it." She looked at him steadily across the fire. "You turned around when the crowd laughed." "I have been in many rooms where people laughed at me and no one turned around. I had stopped expecting anyone to." "Rasha, let me finish," she said. He let her. "I had made a plan for endurance, for surviving the year and going home and having fulfilled the obligation. I had not made a plan for someone who noticed. I had not made a plan for you." She looked at the fire. "I am glad I did not have the right plan. I am glad the plan failed." He got up from his side of the fire and went and sat beside her, and she leaned against him the way she did at the cottage. And he put his arm around her and felt her warmth and her solid reality against the cold of the plains evening. And he thought about all the years he had been going to sea alone, and coming home alone, and lying in a leaking cottage alone, and carrying the weight of it and not naming it. "I was not doing much better," he said. "The turning around was the first right thing I had done in a while, and it was not even brave, I was just angry." "You were angry for me," she said. "Yes," he said. "That is the thing," she said. "That is the exact thing." He held her tighter. The fire popped. The plain's darkness stretched out enormous and full of cold stars in every direction, and somewhere very far to the east the sea was doing what the sea always did, enormous, indifferent, beautiful, making the sound that it makes in the dark when no one is there to hear it, except that someone was on the way, and was bringing someone worth hearing it with. "I love you," he said. He said it to the fire quietly, and then he said it to her, turning his face toward hers slightly louder because she deserved to hear it directly. "I want you to know that, in case I have not been clear." She turned and looked at him. In the firelight her face was warm and open and entirely without the armor that had covered it on an auction platform 3 months ago, and she said in the low voice that carried over distances, "I know. I have known for a while." She put her hand on his jaw. "I love you. I have been waiting to find the moment it was accurate, and it has been accurate for some time." He kissed her, and the fire burned down around them, and the night was long and the plains were quiet, and there was nowhere else on the earth he wanted to be. They reached the coast road 3 days later, and the smell of the sea came first, that specific cold, sharp, alive smell that is nothing like any inland smell, that goes directly to something in the back of the chest and opens it. Ezekiel watched Rasha's face when it hit her. She inhaled and went very still and then turned to look at him with an expression of such uncomplicated delight that he had to look back at the road ahead to maintain his composure. "That is the sea," she said. "That is the sea," he confirmed. "It is nothing like I imagined," she said. "I thought it would smell like a river." "It does not smell like a river," he said. "No," she said, still looking toward it even though it was not visible yet, only the smell and the change in the light and the faint percussion of waves somewhere over the next rise. "It smells like something alive and very old and very large." "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what it smells like." Graven Inlet came into view from the top of the last coastal hill just before midday, and he sat beside her on the wagon bench and looked at it the way you look at something you have known so long you forget to look at it, and then remembered how to look again, because there was someone beside him seeing it for the first time. The inlet was a deep crescent cut into the cliffs, gray-green water folded by the morning wind, the fishing boats rocking on their moorings, the cottages along the clifftop path catching the pale autumn light. The lighthouse on the point was lit, which meant the Caro family was at work, which they always were. The roof of his cottage had not fallen in, which was something. He had been gone 4 months. The cottage was cold and slightly musty, and the leak in the northwest corner had not improved, but the structure held and the fishing gear in the shed was intact, and the inlet was producing. He could tell by the smell of the morning catch hanging at the Caro dock down the path. Rasha walked through the cottage once, slowly, her hand trailing along the walls, looking at things with a precise and thorough attention that he recognized as her assessment mode. She went upstairs to the loft where the ceiling was low, but not as low as at Fenwick's cottage. She looked at the northwest corner where the leak came in. She went back downstairs and stood in the main room with her hands on her hips. "The roof joint on the northwest side needs to be entirely remade," she said. "The current repair is covering the symptom." "I know," he said. "We will fix it before the storms," she said. "Also the door needs rehanging. It does not sit level." "I know that too," he said. She looked at him. "You have been living with a leaking roof and a bad door." "I have been living with a leaking roof and a bad door," he said. "For how long?" "Since I moved in," he said. 12 years. She stared at him with an expression that he was now able to read as the specific face she made when she was doing everything in her power not to laugh at him. "You fixed someone else's roof in a day," she said. "I was motivated," he said. She crossed the room in 2 steps and kissed him thoroughly with both hands on his face, and the cold of the cottage retreated by several degrees. "We will fix it today," she said against his mouth. "Today," he agreed. "After tea." "After tea," she confirmed. They fixed the roof that afternoon, she on the exterior, him on the interior, her directions coming down through the gap, with that quality of absolute precision that they had learned to work from over months of shared labor, and his responses coming up with the trust that had been built one job at a time. The northwest corner held when they finished it. He looked at the line of the joint from below, and it was exactly right. She came in from the exterior with pitch on her hands and satisfaction on her face and said, "That will hold through 5 winters." "At least," he said. She looked around the cottage, which was warmer now with the fire going properly and the bad joint sealed, and the evening was coming in off the water with the sound of the inlet speaking in that way it spoke in the dark, water on stone, wind on water, the particular grammar of a coastline. She looked at him. "This is a good place," she said. "It is better now," he said. She smiled, and it was the full smile, the one that showed the silver lines at the base of her tusks in the firelight. And she crossed to him, and he put his arms around her, and she put her head on top of his, given the height differential, and they stood in the small fixed cottage on the graving cliff top, and listened to the sea below them doing what it had always done and would always do, enormous and old and alive, speaking in a language that required no translation. In the morning the seals came to the inner rocks. He heard them first, that sound from his childhood, the low, resonant, almost human call that had kept him awake until he learned to hear it as company rather than haunting. He shook Rasha awake gently, and she came awake the way she always came awake, fully and immediately, and he said quietly, "Come outside." They stood on the clifftop path in the early morning with their breath misting and the gray water below them and the inner rocks crowded with the dark shapes of the seals, and the sound came up from the water in the cold air, mournful and full and strange. Rasha stood very still for a long moment, listening. "You were right," she said. "You never get used to it." "No," he said. She found his hand in the morning cold and held it. He held hers back. They stood on the cliff above the singing rocks at the edge of the world they had made together, and the sound rose up around them, and neither of them needed to say anything at all. The fishing season came on fast and hard and good. She learned the boat not sailing, which was its own long study, but the working of the inlet nets, the reading of the water, the specific instincts that 12 years had built into Ezekiel's hands, and which he found he could translate for her because she asked precise questions and had the physical capacity to act on the answers immediately. She was stronger than him by a significant measure, and her upper body endurance was in a different class, and the net hauling that had always been his hardest labor became, with her on the other end of the line, simply a task rather than a challenge. The catch doubled in the first month. He bought the inlet partnership rights he had never been able to afford with the accumulated savings from their Dusthaven year. He registered them under both their names at the Graven Harbor office, which produced a full minute of silence from the harbor clerk before the man stamped the document with the expression of someone who had decided that his job was to stamp documents and not to comment on them, which Ezekiel respected. She sent a letter to her mother telling her where they were. The reply came, weeks later, via the coastal post, and it was long, and Rasha sat at the kitchen table reading it for a long time, and when she was done she came and found him in the boat shed and said, "My mother says she is glad I was not careful. She says the careful plan would never have found a man worth keeping." He looked up from the net he was mending. "She has not met me. She says she will come in spring when the mountain passes open," Rasha said. She looked at him with the direct, open expression that was now her default when they were alone. "She will come here to our home." "Then we had better have something good to feed her," he said. Rasha smiled. "She will have opinions about the fishing." "That seems like a family trait," he said. She threw a piece of rope at him, which he caught, and then she sat down across from him in the boat shed and picked up the other end of the net and began mending it in the way he had taught her, quickly and well, because that was also a family trait. And they worked together in the shed while the inlet sounds came through the walls, and the late autumn light stretched long and golden across the water. And outside the Carrow lighthouse was lit on the point, and the seals were on the rocks, and the northwest roof joint held. The bond that had begun in a chain on an auction platform in a dusty trading post had become something that had no name in either treaty language or clan law, because it did not need one. It was simply what it was: two people who had turned toward each other when turning away was the easier thing, and had kept turning, and had kept finding each other there in every room and in every season, and at the edge of every sea. That was the thing. That had always been the exact thing.